Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
I extend my warm greetings to all of you. Once again, I would like to welcome you, dear students. And I am Dr. Raju Maji, Assistant Professor, Faculty of Law, Banarasi University, Varanasi. As we are meeting at the lecture series of Law of Banking and Negotiable Instruments, in this series, I would like to deliver with you the lecture number 12, that is based on the negotiable instruments. Now, dear students, we have discussed many things as far as concerned that in the previous lecture, I have mentioned some of the things of the negotiable instruments, but I would like to mention here the few things which is very important as far as concerned to incorporate in this lecture. The negotiable instruments is regulated through the Negotiable Instruments Act, and it plays a very significant role, particularly in the business or community. Earlier, it was confined to the business community or as far as concerned the banking, but nowadays it is not confined to the business community. Now, it entered into the general people life, and the negotiable instruments plays a very significant role. So, it is a very important task for every scholars of the banking law. They must have the knowledge about the negotiable instruments. Unless and until you have some idea about the negotiable instruments, the banking sector or the banking law you cannot understand. That is why I have taken a very utmost care to discuss with you all the negotiable instruments. I have divided these negotiable instruments in the 3 lectures, and the first lecture which I will discuss with you, that is the lecture number 12, on which I will discuss only as far as concerned the Negotiable Instruments Act, its kinds and its characteristics, and some extent I will conclude with the what are the differences between these negotiable instruments. Now, as I have told you that I have divided this lecture in the 4 heads, and I will discuss one by one. The first we will understand that what do you mean by the negotiable instruments, that the first what is the definitions and what do you mean by it. And the second thing then we will see that what are the kinds of negotiable instruments, that is very important, and then we will try to understand what are the characteristics of negotiable instruments, and finally, we will try to differentiate it in under the last of this lecture. Now, let me tell you that as I have told you that the negotiable instruments plays a very significant role as far as concerned for the day to day our transactions, and that particularly that the banking. Earlier days, as I have told you, that is confined to the public community because they were using it, but nowadays as far as concerned, as we have discussed that the importance of banking sector in our day to day life, as nowadays the banking plays a very significant role, and without the banking nowadays we cannot imagine that we can meet out our day to day needs. So, in either way that the negotiable instruments we are facing such kind of the problems or we are meeting with the negotiable instruments. So, let us try to understand what do you mean by negotiable instruments. As far as concerned the negotiable instruments, when we will talk, then we find that the negotiable instruments has been defined under section 13 of the Negotiable Instruments Act. But before reading the negotiable instruments which is given or which is defined under section 13 of the Act, the 2-3 things which I like to mention before you. You will have to understand in that way that the negotiable means, again I am talking about that it is a negotiable and it is a transferable. If any instruments which is not transferable, that cannot be comes under the definition of a negotiable instrument. So, the one very important aspect of negotiable instruments that must be transferable from one hand to another hand. Now, this can be done by the two way, the one that is in form of the order and another in form of the undertaking. So, the undertaking and the order we will entire discussion we will find these two words, that the undertaking and the second word, that is order. And on the basis of that, we will see that what are the characteristics of the negotiable instruments, and at the same time we will try to understand that the characteristics which is available, how it will distinguish each other. At the same time we will find that naturally that who are the parties of it, although as I have told you the parties, the responsibility I will discuss in the separate lecture, but as far as right now that we will directly those who are involved with it, we will not discuss their obligations or you can say the liabilities, because we will discuss in details in the separate means lecture. So, that is why let me allow to read out the section 13 what says. The section 13 says, a negotiable instrument means a promissory note, bill of exchange or check payable either to order or bearer. Now, if you will read this, then you will find the three words here. That means, the negotiable instruments, the section 30 is not defining the negotiable instrument. It is only taking the some sort of the name, and as far as concerned the section 13, and if I will further, if I will elaborate in that the different way, then we will see that the three can be considered as far as concerned the section 13 of the negotiable instruments. But I am telling you that the section 13 is not restricted to that. Section 13 is talking about that, okay, these are the three instruments which can be considered as far as concerned the statute part of the. So, the statutory definitions if you will see, then we find the negotiable instruments that is restricted or you can say limited to the three, but nowhere it is mentioned under the section 13 that the other things which is customary accepted, or you can say the which is existing in the practice from the olden days of from the earlier time. So, that will not be excluded under the section 30, but it included only the three names, that is one, the promissory note, the bill of exchange and the check. So, by keeping these definitions, as I have told you this, it talks about these are the three instruments which is considered as negotiable instruments. So, our entire lecture will be move around the three things, and I will try to generalize these three apart from the definitions which is given. These three terms have been defined under section 4, section 5 and section 6. Section 4 is talking about the promissory note, section 5 is talking about the bill of exchange and the section 6 is talking about the check. We will discuss in detail, but let me again discuss more details that when we are talking about the negotiable instruments is under section 13, when we are going through the section 13, which merely states that the negotiable instrument means the promissory note, bill of exchange or check payable either to order or bearer. Now, this does not indicate the characteristics of a negotiable instrument, but only states there three instruments, that is check, bill of exchange and promissory note are negotiable instruments. The three instruments are therefore negotiable instruments by statute. There is nothing to be agitated by calling, by reading or by understanding the section 13, the words of the section 13 which very clearly mentioned that these are the three negotiable instruments. These are the promissory note, the bill of exchange and the check. And that is why the scholars they call it, these are the three statutorily accepted, or you can say that these are the negotiable instruments which is a part of the statute, because the statute we have to regulate the negotiable instruments, and that is the Negotiable Instruments Act 1881, and under that act the section 13 is talking about. It is it can be say in the other way, it is not defining, but it is indicating the three kinds of you can say the instruments which can be called the negotiable instruments, that is promissory note, bill of exchange and check. In that way we can say that the section 13 does not prohibit any other instruments which satisfy the essential features of negotiability to be treated as negotiable instruments. The essential features of a negotiable instrument is its negotiability, as I have told you, that any instrument which is transferable from one hand to another and which can be made by the maker or the drawer, that is very important. If the drawer or the maker has no right to draw it, even that the certain instrument which is transferable from one hand to another, that cannot be termed as a negotiable, because negotiability is there. For example, I am taking the example, and that might be the reason that under section 4 of the act, where the promissory note has been defined, the notes, bank notes, that is excluded from the definition of the promissory note. But if you will go through the characteristics of the you can say that the bank notes, then you will find that it is transferable from one hand to another hand. But even why it is excluded, the reason behind it, because the persons, any persons cannot be prepared the notes, any persons cannot be prepared the bank notes. That can be done by the persons who is authorized under the Reserve Bank of India Act, and that person is the person, that is the governor of the RBI. Only on his signature he is making or taking undertakings to pay the money, or you can say the sum which is mentioned in that the note. And if we will go through that words, I promise to pay it there. When we are talking the promissory note, that is also promised to pay, but as far as concerned that the promissory note I can prepare it subject to if the other person is ready to pay it. But as far as concerned that if I will try to make the bank notes, I am not entitled to prepare the bank notes. So that is why it is excluded, knowingly it is excluded. Although if the other kind of, you can say that the essential characteristics, when you will discuss, then you will find these essential characteristics are available with the bank notes also, but it is excluded from the definitions knowingly. The reason behind it, because each and every person cannot be prepared by the prepared the bank notes. That is the reason that it cannot included under the definition of a section 4, where the term, or you can say the negotiable instruments, the promissory note where it is defined. So, as far as concerned, as I have told you, the section 13 does not prohibit any other instruments which satisfy the essential features of negotiability to be treated as negotiable instrument. The essential features of the negotiable instruments, its negotiability. Negotiability here means again it is transferable from one hand to another hand until, as you have discussed earlier also, until the payment has been made, or it is realized, or it is satisfied. It can be transferred from one hand to another hand. It continues. So, if that features is there, that will consider the definition of a negotiable instrument. That similar kind of features we require, or we will see that it is available in the, when we will talk about the promissory note, or when we will talk about the bill of exchange, or when we will talk about the check. But at this moment, just I would like to cite some of the example that these are, why these are excluded. One example which cite before you, that the bank notes, they are excluded from the definition of the promissory note. The reason behind it, because it can be issued by a specific authorized persons, that is the governor RBI. Only in his signature he is giving or taking or delivering the undertaking on behalf of the central government. As far as concerned, the Reserve Bank has the rights of issuing a bank notes, but the content, if you will see, the same kind of contents is made under the promissory note. As far as concerned, there is no any kind of dissimilarity. But the other kind of, you consider section 13, it is not prohibiting. As far as concerned, if I will take the example of our country, that railway receipts, they are very popularly which is used as a promissory note. And the second thing which we are using as a negotiable instruments, the second, if you will see the other instruments which we are using in a very, from the very ancient day, the word is hundi, H-U-N-D-I. The hundi is one of, you can say, the ancient the practices which were existed from the immemorial time, and it is accepted by the commercial community. Although at the present time it has no, you can say, the meaning, or it has no any kind of the practice, but as far as concerned that if the someone will enter into that, so we cannot deny it by calling that it is negotiable instruments, because it is the essential characteristic, the negotiability exist with that documents. But in the other hand, if I will talk about the some of the instruments that has some sort of the characteristic, it can, but it cannot be treated as a negotiable instruments. The reason behind it, because it is not negotiable. For example, the bank drafts, it is prepared, but it is not transferable, because it is made for a specific purpose, and it is made through the specific by the men. It cannot be transferred from one person to another, because it is already mentioned they are not negotiable. Means it is not negotiable. The reason behind it, that is why that it cannot be said that it is a negotiable instrument. Similarly, if we will talk about the another instruments which is available for making the payment to someone or to fulfilling their demands, that is nowadays it is not you can say used by that way, but earlier it played a very significant role in the every, you can say, the government jobs, etc. When any applicant is filing application, then the mode of payment was, that is the postal order. So, postal order is also not a negotiable instrument. The reason behind it, the postal order is, as soon as you are putting anyone's name, that can be through that, payment can be made through that, means again it is the questions before that, it is not for the negotiable, it cannot be negotiated. So, that is why if even that such kind of the documents, it remains, you can say that it having the other characteristics which we will discuss later, that what are the characteristics of a negotiable instruments, but due to that one essential characteristics which is missing on that part, that is the negotiability, that will not be considered as a negotiable instruments, although the other characteristics that are fulfilled by going through that documents, but that will not be included under the definition of negotiable instruments. The reason behind it, because it has the one characteristics which is very important to be called any instrument as a negotiable instruments, that is the negotiability. But as I have told you that the section 13 is very much silent on that. The other kind of negotiable instruments which is existed in the past practice, or even still prevailing, even in the not popular, but it is there. So, can it be enforced? So, the answer is yes. As I have told you that the hundi, if the people they are using it, it is all right, there is no problem, and the act is not prohibiting, or the section 13 is not barring. But for the convenient, the section 13 is talking about these three things will be constitute, or you can say they considered as a negotiable instruments, that is promise note, bill of exchange and the check. Now, the very important things to understand the negotiable instruments, we will have to see that what are the essential features of a negotiable instruments. So, the following are the special features of negotiable instruments. Let me allow to discuss one by one. That the first essential elements, as I have told you, that the negotiability, which again and again I am reiterating, the negotiable instruments, that persons, the maker have the right to independently he can prepare it, and the other persons, he must be ready to accept it. That is very important. But on the other hand, as I have told you that essential content is available with the banknotes. There is a promise is made by, and it is transferable from more hand, we can say, in comparison to the promise note or the bill of exchange or the check. But besides that, it is excluded from the definition of it, because it cannot be prepared by any person. So, the negotiable instruments are easily transferable from person to person, and the ownership of the property in the instrument may be passed by one mere delivery. In case of bearer instruments, or by endorsement and delivery in case of an order instrument. Transferability is an essential feature of a negotiable instruments, but all transferable instruments are not negotiable instruments. As I have told you that everything that will not be a part of it, because it carries, but if it is not you can say the defined under the section 13, or you can say it is not included as a practice, it is all right, but it will not be considered when we are talking about the statutory definitions of the negotiable instruments. The second, the essential features of, we can say, the negotiable instruments, apart from the first one, again let me read out the first provisions. As I have told you, the negotiable instruments are easily transferable from one person to another person. And as a transferring, what we are doing, as a transferring, we are transferring the ownership of the property in the instrument may be passed by one, how? That by mere delivery, as we have discussed under when we have discussed the endorsement. So, the mere delivery, it can be negotiated, and the further we can say that can be negotiated in the different way, how? That the person is endorsing, through the endorsement it can be negotiated. But as far as concerned the second the characteristics when we are looking, then it says a negotiable instrument confers absolute and good title on the transferee to the persons who is transferring that, and the persons who is receiving the transferee, transferor and transferee. The persons who is transferring, he is designated as a transferor, and to whom it is transferred, he is the transferee. So, the negotiable instrument confers absolute and good title on the transferee who takes it in good faith for value and without notice of the fact that the transferor had defective title thereto, even if the transferor might had the defective title, but as far as concerned the transferee that he will entitle if he has accepted with the bona fide intention. Knowingly if he is accepted that okay, he is not entitled, that the title is defective, and even if he is accepting, then we can say that the safe which is available, that is not available to the transferee, but in the remaining cases if he is accepted with the intention that the transferor is having the right over that instrument and he has transfer right with the intention to transfer his ownership from to the other. So, in that way, that is the words which is used, that is the good faith. That means, the transferee has the belief that the transferor has or transferor is entitled to exercise that rights. When he is exercising in that way and he is accepting as a transferee, he is accepting in good faith, he is not going to affect any kind of his right. This is the most important characteristics of a negotiable instrument. A person who takes a negotiable instrument from another person who had stolen it from somebody else will have absolute and undisputable title to the instrument provided he receives the same for value after paying its full value and in good faith without knowing that the transferor was not the true owner of the instrument. Such a person is called the holder in due course and is interest in the instruments well protected by the law. So, again I would like to express you that as a transferee, the transferee if he accepted any value from the transferor and he received the payment of that, and the later on if it is found that the transferor had no title over that, so the transferee is not committing any kind of, you can say, the offense and his rights is protected. Now, I am coming to the types of, you can say, the negotiable instruments, as we have already read under section 13, where the very, you can say, they clearly mentioned, but to understand that we can divide the negotiable instruments in two categories. The one that is which is accepted or you can say given under the statute, and other the negotiable instruments by custom or usage. Again I am repeating it, although as I have already mentioned that under section 13 nowhere it is mentioned or we can say that it is restricting or it is limiting that the other kind of, you can say, apart from the three, the name which is been written under section 13 of the act, that is the promissory note, bill of exchange and the check, and the others will excluded from the definitions of, you can say, the negotiable instruments. Nowhere it is mentioned, neither it is restricting. So, scholarly then in that way we can understand that if it is not restricted, is still that it is enforceable, then we can divide or we can categorize the negotiable instruments into two parts. The one, though the negotiable instruments possess the above mentioned features, they fall into two categories as follows. The one, the negotiable instruments by statute, as I have already read out before you, that is the section 13 of the Negotiable Instruments Act. So, the Negotiable Instruments Act 1881 states three instruments: check, bill of exchange and promissory notes as negotiable instruments. They are therefore called negotiable instruments by statute. So, it is very clear that we can categorize these two by the version or you can say the statement which he made or the way on which section 13 defines the negotiable instruments. It compels us, or as scholarly we can categorize that if the other instruments which are in practice still existing in the practice, that are not excluded under the definition of section 13, although the section 13 took three name only, or in that way we can understand that the statutory, when we are looking towards that what to mean by the negotiable instruments, then of course we can say that these are the three things which is considered the negotiable instruments as far as concerned. That is section 13 of the negotiable instruments, as that is these are the check, bill of exchange and promissory note. But the second category we can say, because the section 13, as I have told you, that it is not restricting, it is not limiting, it is not prohibiting to accept the other you can say the instrument which is existing or still it is existed in the society and the people they are using for their to meet out their purpose. That is, as I have cited very good example, if you go through any book, then you will find the name HUNDI, Hundi. So, the negotiable instruments by customer uses. Some other instruments have acquired the character of the negotiability by custom or usage of trade. Section 136 of the Transfer of Property Act 1882 also recognized that an instrument may be negotiable by law or custom. So, the two things, as I have told you, the section 13 is not excluding, but the section 13 is silent over it. But on the other hand, when we are talking about the Transfer of Property Act, if you read the section 136 of the Transfer of Property Act 1882, which also recognize that an instruments may be negotiable by law or custom. Now, I am coming to the first kind of, you can say, that the statutory definitions which we found. So, as I have told you that I will confine my lecture within by discussing the three, as we have seen the statutory. My intention is not to exclude or not to regard, but as one concern that due to the, you can say, the acceptance of a check, the other kind of, you can say, the instrument has no, you can say, the relevance at the present time, because it is the very easy and it, you can say, that which can be easily accepted by each and every person. The reason behind it, the realizations is very important. The reason behind it, because it imposes the penalty over the parties if they are not complying the provisions of the Negotiable Instruments Act. So, the promissory note, as I have told you, it is defined under section 4 of the Negotiable Instruments Act. If before reading these provisions, as I have told you that it is a kind of promise, and as one concern that when we are talking the party, then it requires the two party, the one who is the promising and other who is accepting it. So, the acceptor and the promisor, they will find that the two persons only. So, the section 40 is defining the term promissory note, and it says a promissory note is an instrument in writing containing an unconditional undertaking signed by the maker to pay a certain sum of money only to or to the order of a certain persons or to the bearer of the instrument. Again, I am reading this provision. What is that? First thing is talking about a promissory note is an instrument in writing. Then we can understand the first characteristics of an instrument, what is the necessary as far as the promissory note when we are talking about, that it must be in writing. But as far as concerned, when you might have read under the Contract Act, the Contract Act as far as concerned, to enter into a contract, the contract is also, if you will see the essential element, then you will find that the promise and the acceptance, that is the essential element of a contract to be converted into the contract. So, as far as concerned, when the parties are entering into the contract, it is not necessary the contract must be in a written form. It is not necessary. Even the consent can be given, you can say, the orally. In other way, we can say that the orally the persons can enter into the contract and the contract is enforceable by law. It cannot be said that no, there is no any kind of the written, but it is step side. If you are entering into the written form, it can be produced as an evidence, and as far as the orally, then at least you have to provide before the court of law that who were witness at the time. So, that may be the step side we can say, but it cannot be said that the contents or the parties were entered into a contract by means of the oral or the verbal, that will becomes a part and that is enforceable by the law. But on the other hand, when we are talking about the negotiable instruments, it cannot be said that when the two persons are promising each other to pay certain things, the certain amount after the certain date, that will not be considered as a negotiable instruments. That is a part of the contract, and the party have that, and for that purpose, that it cannot be enforced through the negotiable instruments. I am not saying that cannot be enforced, that can be enforced, but that can be enforced through the Contract Act 1872. But if it is, why it is, because it requires the written form. So, the orally or verbal, if you have entered into any kind of the agreements, even that is for the purpose of paying some sort of, you can say, the money, because the another content which is required as far as concerned to be called or essential characteristics of the negotiable instruments, that is must be sum only, or you can say the money only. But even the parties are entering for that purpose, but it cannot be called the negotiable instruments because it is not available in a written form. So, the first and foremost thing it is talking about it must be in writing. Containing an unconditional undertaking, it is very important as far as concerned. When you are entering into the contract, then you will find that there is a condition. But as far as concerned, when you are making an instrument, the negotiable instrument, there must not be any kind of the conditions. The parties cannot impose any kind of the conditions. But we will discuss in detail that if without putting some sort of the conditions, that how the negotiable instruments can be prepared, that is a big question. But we will see that will not be called as a conditions, and even the parties can put such kind of conditions, but as far as concerned to consider that particular instruments, or you can say the content of the instruments of the negotiable instruments, that will not come under the definition of that condition, that will treat it as unconditional. We will see in the latter part when we will discuss that what do you mean by the unconditional undertaking. So, it is an unconditional undertaking. Unconditional undertaking means the parties agreed to pay, signed by the maker. The very important thing is that the instruments must be signed by the maker. The person who is preparing, his signature is very important. To pay a certain sum, the sum means the money. That means the negotiable instruments, if the partially, even if you are entering that okay, the someone is promising that I promise to pay the B rupees 500, and also I deliver the 100 kgs of sugar. So, that will not be a part of the negotiable instruments, that can be a part of your general contract, but that cannot be said, because it is the negotiable instruments is talking about that must be made in writing, that must be made without any kind of conditions, and that must be what? That must be for sum only. When we are talking about the sum only, that the sum must be certain one. When we are talking about that I promise to pay whatever the money owes to him, so that is not, that cannot complete. Why? Because the sum is not certain there. You have not mentioned the what money you owe to him, and for which you are promising that I will pay after the 30 days, 40 days, whatever it may be, but you are not mentioning the money, you are not mentioning what is the sum, the amount. So, that will not be considered, because it is talking about that must be certain, and not only the certain, it can be made for the sum only. Even in the partially we cannot make the sum part that in you can say in the sum of the money, and the remaining part that can be paid in the goods, that is not a content of any negotiable instruments. The negotiable instruments means it is for the sum only, that is sum means the money, it must be paid in terms of the money, and the money must be certain. That means you will have to mention in the instruments what is the amount. You cannot live like this without certaining or ascertaining that what would be the amount. So, you will have to mention the amount also. Money only to or to the order of certain persons or to the bearer of the instrument. So, you are going to pay whom, you are the undertaking you are making for whom, the parties must be certain one. If we will see the definitions of the promissory note, it makes it clear that it is an instrument in writing containing an unconditional undertaking signed by the maker to pay on demand the amount mentioned therein, or to the order of a certain persons to the bearer of the instrument. The promissory note as an instrument is negotiable. So, it is again the transferable from one man to another. I would like to mention one very important case, in the case of Kedori Lal versus Sukhpal. It is decided by the Madhya Pradesh High Court, and the Madhya Pradesh High Court held that an instrument which does not satisfy the requirement of negotiability on the face of it as requirement under section 4 of the Negotiable Instruments Act may still become negotiable by reason of section 13 read with the explanation 1, so far as the Negotiable Instruments Act is concerned. It is supporting the documents that even if the such kind of, as I have cited one name, that is the Hundis, that is still in practice, and that will be considered, although its name is not mentioned under section 13 of the Act. Let me tell you that the certain illustrations which will make you clear again to understand that what the things which we have discussed. As far as concerned, that one very important things, apart from that in writing, it is all right. The second thing, as you were talking about, the parties must be certain, it is all right. The third thing, we have seen that the money must be paid, it is all right. The signature of the maker, it is all right. But the one very important thing, the unconditional undertaking, that is very important, that had to be discussed, and that we can understand by going through some of the illustrations. If you will go through the bare act, these illustrations are given, I have taken from there. I would like to read out before you that the illustrations which is given there. It says, assigns instruments in the following terms. A signs instruments in the following terms. The clause A says, I promise to pay B or order rupees 500. Again I am repeating it. The A is making an instrument, and the content of the instrument is, I promise to pay B. I is there because he will put his signature, so A will put his signature, so A's existence is there. He is promising to pay to whom? The B. The parties, we got it. The parties are certain. Who are the parties? Parties are A and the parties are B. A undertakes to pay the B rupees 500. So, what is the third essential thing is? That is, the sum must be certain. Sum must be certain. Do you find any kind of, you can say, the conditions here when the statement is made by the A and he is putting his signature? So, there is no any kind of the conditions. He simply says, I promise to pay the B or order rupees 500. So, there is no any kind of, you can say, the specific, the content is given, that what would be the content. The content is what? The content must be specifically, or you can say very clearly, it is shown that the party's intention. What is the party's intention? A is intention to promise to pay. So, the intention is very clear that I promise to pay. To whom? To B. What is the sum? That is 500. There is no any kind of the conditions. It is all right. So, that will comes under the definition of a promissory note. The second illustration, clause B is talking about, I acknowledge myself to be indebted to B in rupees 1000 to be paid on demand for value received. Again, if you see that I acknowledge myself to be indebted to B in rupees 1000 to be paid on demand for value received. There is also no any kind of the conditions. Parties are clear and his acknowledgement is there. The acknowledgement is not, you can say, the hidden. It is very clearly said that I acknowledge. What is acknowledgement? Indebtedness. I have to owe the rupees, the 1000 towards the B. Whenever I will get the value, I will pay that. So, the intention is very clear. There is no any kind of the conditions is there. Now, they come to the clause C. The clause C is talking about Mr. B, I owe you rupees 1000. Now, this is not clear. The version which is used, it can be read in the different way. The meaning can be established in the different way. So, if the such kind of things, the present time if you will see that we are in a very much, you can say, the accepted practice, like the SMS language we can say, but as I consider the negotiable instruments, it is talking about the SMS language, or you can say some kind of the abbreviations that is not permissible. The reason behind it, before the rule of law, the parties, the instruments who is making, he may change. I am always citing one example before the students, that suppose if I am talking about, if I use and I will ask you that, okay, you tell me the full form of the abbreviation AIR. So, the law students, they will say the All India Reporter, but as far as the general people, if it is asked, then they will tell you that it is All India Radio. And in the both the circumstances you will find, or both the situations you will find, the both parties are right. So, it is a subject matter of interpretation, and that is why that any kind of the ambiguity language is not accepted by the maker when he is making, that the intention must be clear, and such kind of ambiguity is not accepted. That is why that when he is talking of the Mr. V, I owe you, if you go through the uttering, then it says that I owe you the rupees 1000, but as far as the word which is used, it is very difficult. If he will mention that I and OWE, and YOU, that might be accepted, but if the abbreviations he used, it is said that it is not a content of the negotiable instrument, and such kind of the ambiguity will not be accepted as a content of the negotiable instrument. So, it cannot be called that it is a promised note. And the clause D is talking about I promise to pay B rupees 500, first deducting there out any money which he may owe me. Now, there is a conditions there. What is the conditions? The conditions is that I promise to pay B rupees 500, it is all right. First deducting there out any money which he may owe me. So, the second condition is not clear, that what amount, that is not mentioned. If the amount only mentioned, that might be clear and that might be accepted as a content of the promised note, but in the second part there is not clear, that is why it will not be treated as a promissory note. The clause E, it is talking about I promise to pay B rupees 500, first deducting there out any money which may owe me. Clause F further it is talking about I promise to pay B rupees 500 7 days after my marriage with C. There is a condition. What is condition? That the first part is all right, I promise to pay B rupees 500. 7 days after my marriage with C, it is impossible kind of, you can say, the things has been mentioned. So, it is a condition one, because it cannot be fulfilled easily. I am not saying that it will not take place, it might be fulfilled, but it is not easy. The what is that? 7 days after my marriage with the C, whether the party who is making the instruments, he may not enter into the marriage relationship, it is not necessary, it is nowhere it is mentioned that you will have to be entered into that, no law can compel you to enter into that relations, and particularly that when the marriage we are talking about, the validity of the marriage, we need the consent of the other party, it is not necessary the C will give consent. So, it is a conditions, and the conditions cannot be applicable, because it is talking about the undertaking. What kind of undertaking? Unconditional undertaking, and there is a condition. So, and what kind of conditions has been put by the maker? Because it cannot be performed very easily, event may not take place. The clause G further it is talking about I promise to pay B rupees 500 on D's death, provided D leaves me enough to pay that sum. If I will stop here, suppose that I promise to pay B rupees 500 on D's death, that will be accepted. Why that will be accepted? Because the event will take place. Date is not, you consider, certain, but the death will take place. It is as far as in the present situations which will have, the science has not developed that much. So, the date is natural one, death will take place, the time is not certain. So, if the someone is entering into that kind of, so it will come under that unconditional. Why? The events will take place. Of course, the date is not you can say certain, but the event which is mentioned, the death of D's, that is certain one, but as I have told you, the death is not, you can say date is not certain, but in that way it can be accepted. But what is the problem is that why it would not be accepted as a you can say the promissory note, because he mentioned further which is condition one, conditional one, the undertaking is conditional one. What is that? Provided D leaves me enough to pay that sum. Nobody knows it. At the time of death of D, the D will leave rupees 500, and it says that if the D will not leave, then I will not pay. So, that is the conditions, and the conditions, it may not necessary that events will comply to the events will take place. So, the such kind of things are considered the conditions, and it will not be a part of it. The clause H again it is talking about I promise to pay B rupees 500 and to deliver to him my black horse on 1st January next. So, there is also the uncertain conditions is there that cannot be fulfilled very easily. So, in that way that there are the two things which I have read in the clause A and clause B are promised note, and the remaining instruments respectively marked in the C, D, E, F, G, H are not promised note. The reason behind it very clear that there is a conditions, and let me explain that what you mean by the condition and unconditional. If I am saying that I promise to pay rupees 500 to B on the expiry of 5 months. So, I am putting here that on the expiry of 5 months. So, I am putting conditions, the date as I am putting that I will pay after 5 months, not right now. Today I will take from the B, but I will you can say the paid only when the 5 months will expire. So, the 5 months is a condition, but that conditions is certain one. It can be fulfilled, but there are certain conditions which we have read under the clause C, D, E, F that cannot be fulfilled, or even if it is fulfilled, but it is very uncertainty. So, if any conditions which the maker is putting that will not considered as a negotiable instruments, the reason behind it that will be treated as a conditional one, and it is talking about it is unconditional undertaking. So, that it is necessary to be called as a promissory note, that the condition without condition, as I have told you, the dates etc. when you are putting, that is also condition, but that is acceptable, and it will comes under the understanding of that what it is unconditional one. The promissory note must possess the following characteristics, as I have already discussed with you. I am repeating it, that the first thing, as I have told you, the writing. The first thing is the written. It is already, when we read the section 4, it is there, it is that in the writing form. So, the writing is very important. The first essential is that all negotiable instruments must be in writing. An oral agreement to pay a sum of money is not an instrument, much less negotiable. The reason behind it, because that will not be negotiable further. So, it is made between the two persons, that is over. Then the second one is the promise to pay. Then it says the promissory note means unconditional undertaking for what? To make payment. So, that the second essential characteristics is that is promise to pay. It must contain a promise to pay. A mere acknowledgement of debt is not a promissory note. Simply that you are acknowledging, that is not. Your acknowledgement must be very clear. If I use the one sentence, I acknowledge to you, that is clear, but it will not considered as a negotiable instruments or a promissory note, because the mere acknowledgement is not. But as far as concerned, the clause B, when we read, at the time it is written, I acknowledge that I intended rupees 500 to you. So, that is I am saying that I owe towards you. So, that is very important. And the third one, which I have already discussed with you, the unconditional. The promise to pay the money should be unconditional or subject to only to a conditions which according to ordinary experience of mankind is bound to happen. As I have told you that as a general understanding, that the things which will easily take place, that might be the event when take place, that time is not certain, but the event will take place. As I have cited one example, the death is certain, but date is not certain. But that will, if someone is putting and if the other party is agreed on it, it is all right. But as you have read one illustrations, as is talking about that on the death of D, I will pay when the D leave that much amount. That is the things that is uncertain, and that is why that was not considered as a promissory note. And the last one, as I have told you, that the very important thing which is required, that the negotiable instruments is made for only and only for sum only, that is the money. So, it must be made for the money only. The instrument must be payable in money and money only. If the instrument contains a promise to pay something other than money or something in addition to money, it will not be a promissory note. The sum of money payable must also be certain. The Act nowhere requires that the amount should be stated both in words and figures, but this has become usual. In recognitions of this fact, the section 18 says that in case of discrepancy, the amount stated in words will prevail, which we have already discussed that if there is Negotiable Instruments Act, at the time of honoring the check, or you can say either he is acting as a paying banker or the collecting banker. Particularly when he is acting as a paying banker, the banker will honor, but as I have told you the general practice, he will not honor. And similarly, that in the negotiable instruments it is not mandatory, it is not made mandatory because it is no any kind of the specific, you can say the pro forma is accepted. It is only that the content must be there, which indicates that it is a part of it. But as far as concerned that if you have mentioned in the words and figures, as far as concerned the section 18 of the Negotiable Instruments Act it is talking about, it can be considered. If there is any kind of the discrepancy in by using the words and the figures, then we will accept what that is the things which is mentioned in the words that will prevails. The parties must be certain, as I have told you, that the parties as far as the maker and the other party who is in behalf of whom the undertaking is taken, that the parties must be certain one. Means at the time of preparing the documents, the parties must be certain. You cannot live in the ambiguity that or you are putting without any kinds of like the blank endorsement that you are not reporting the name of the parties, that will not considered as that the promised note. So, or the negotiable instruments. In both the cases, what you required, the parties to the instrument must be designated with reasonable certainty. There are two parties to a promised note, namely the persons who makes the note and is known as the maker, the persons who is making, he is known as the maker, and the payee to whom the promise is made. Both the maker and the payee must be indicated with certainty on the face of the instrument, on the face of the instrument. And the further, if we are talking about as the final which I have made, that it must be signed by the maker. So, if the instrument has not been signed by the maker, then it is not a promised note. So, it is essential that the instrument must be signed by the maker. These and every, these are the 6 things which is very important as, or you can say the characteristics of a promissory note. I am coming to the second, the instruments, that is negotiable instruments which is considered, that is the bill of exchange. So, bill of exchange has been defined under section 5 of the Act, and the section 5 states that bill of exchange means a bill of exchange is an instrument in writing containing an unconditional order signed by the maker directing a certain persons to pay a certain sum of money only to or to the other of her certain persons or to the bearer of the instrument. Now, if you will compare with the previous things, the definitions which you have read under the section 13 of the Act, and when the term has been defined under section 4 of the Negotiable Instruments Act, what is that? That was the promised note. Now, the first thing is very important, that it is also the instrument in writing. So, there is no any kind of the difference between these two. As I have told you that I will compare these two things, but as far as concerned that when we are comparing the right now we can compare that it is also required because it is a part of the Negotiable Instruments Act. So, it must be in writing. But as far as concerned, what is that in the promised note we find the unconditional. What is that in the promised note we find that it is an unconditional undertaking. On the other hand, it is talking about the unconditional order. So, the promised note is an undertaking. On the other hand, when we are talking about the bill of exchange is an order. Bill of exchange is an order signed by the maker, directing a certain persons to pay a certain sum of money only to or to the order of a certain persons or to the bearer of the instrument. So, in that way we find that as far as concerned the parties are concerned, under the promised note we find there are the 2 persons are involved for completing the or preparing or making the promised note. But as far as concerned that as far as concerned the negotiable instruments, we need 3 persons. The one person who is making the instruments, he is called the drawer. The another persons to whom the order has been made by the maker that you will have to pay, he is a drawee under this. The second person who is involved, the second party who is involved, to whom the order has been made or order is going to be made for the payment, and the persons to whom the payment will be made, he is payee. So, in that way we find that as far as the parties are concerned, to complete the promissory story, the bill of exchange, we require three parties. The one with the maker is called the drawer, and then the order is made to whom, that or by the payment, who is going to make payment, that is the drawee, and the persons to whom payment will be made, that is the payee. So, the drawer, drawee and payee. Now, so as far as concerned the parties of the bill of exchange, the drawer is the person who draws the bill. He must sign it. Though there is no objection its being accepted before the drawer places his signature on it, it remains incomplete and cannot be issued. The three parties, as I have already discussed before you, that the drawee. A drawee is a person on whom the bill is drawn. He becomes the acceptor after he has signified his assent to the order of the drawer by writing the words accepted right across to the face of the bill with his signature and date. And the payee, the payee is the persons to whom or to whose order the money is directed by the instrument to be paid. The drawer may make the bill payable to him, or may name another persons in the bill to whom he has to be paid. And the holder, that is, the holder means any persons entitled in his own name to the possessions of the instrument and to receive or recover the amount thereon from the parties thereto. So, the last part of this is the check. So, check is also a negotiable instrument. The same kind of content is given there, and the check is defined under section 6, because we will discuss the check in a very separate form, in the separate way. So, the check it is talking about that it is also a kind of the bill of exchange. Then what is the difference between the check and the bill of exchange? If I am talking about a bill of exchange, so difference between that, in case of the bill of exchange, the parties are same. In case of the check, the parties are same. Only the one person is the distinguished. Who is that? The drawee. Drawee is the specified banker. And if when we are talking about the drawee, the specified banker, that means the persons, who is the persons? The persons, the drawer is the what? Drawer is the specified bankers of customers. He is a customers of that specified bankers. So, in the conclusion, just I would like to mention the very important thing, as far as concerned, that the first part, that is the section 4. The section 4, that is the promissory note, that can be between any of the two persons, subject to if they are accepting each other, they are ready to accept each other. But as far as concerned, that when we are talking about the order, any two persons cannot make an order, any persons cannot make an order. So, there is a pre-existing relationship. What is the pre-existing relationship? That is creditor and debtor relationship. That is why the creditor has a right to order towards whom? The order towards the debtor to pay it. So, the customers and the bankers, when we have discussed the as far as concerned the check, it is the specified banker by whom? By his customers. The customers is creditor, he is making an order to the drawer to pay the bearer, the persons who is going through that documents. He will be a part of it. In the same way that there is a pre-existing relationship out of the bank, that is the bill of exchange, whether two persons they have the relationship, that is the creditor debtor, the creditor again he is making an order for the payment, but as far as concerned the bankers and the check and the bill of exchange, the difference between that the check, there is no any kind of, you can say the acceptance is required from the banker. Only what is the required, that you must have the sufficient fund in the bank. On the other hand, as far as concerned, that when we are talking about to make an order, it is required from the drawee to get acceptance. So, that is the difference between these two instruments, as a check or the bill of exchange. But as far as concerned, the both are bill of exchange. As I have earlier told you that I will discuss again that the disjoiner or the parties of the negotiable instruments in a separate lecture. So, we have that, do not worry about it. If anything not clear, we will clear. So, with this hope, it is one of the, you can say, very simplest the lecture which I have given before you, but it is very important to know who are the parties, what are the characteristics of the negotiable instruments, and the characteristics is very important, as I have discussed, as I have told you. Again I will refer the some of the things when I will discuss in the next 2 lecture that is related with the parties of the negotiable instruments and their liabilities, and others is the checks and the dishonour of check. Thank you very much.